You're listening to an Anazao Ministries podcast.
Should there be a separation of church and state? I mean, Jedi and the Republic? Where do the weapons of the Empire and the rebels come from? And how hard is it to rebuild after you've taken down the man? We're going to be discussing all of that and more in this segment of our primarily political series. We're going to be talking about the politics in our favorite fandoms from a Christian perspective. It's a very niche series, if I do say so myself. And Star Wars, of all things, has a ton of politics. So pray for us. Pray for us. This is Systematic Geekology. We are the priests to the geeks. And but when we say that, we just mean that we are trying to be the mediators between our faith and fandoms that we all love and enjoy. There's two communities. We all have one foot in each. We're going to be trying to cross some bridges. And while we're doing it, we're talking about politics. You might wonder why. Why is a Christian show doing politics? So we're going to do a little bit of apologetic work here just for a second. We're doing this series primarily political because a lot of times, especially here in the US, where we're all from, politics are very polarizing. And in 2024, we're going to have another national election. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of polarizing things in the meantime. So we want to show how can we disagree well. And at the same time, we also want to do something a little bit more lighthearted. So rather than talking about US politics or who we're going to vote for, we're going to talk about themes, political themes in our favorite fandoms. Last time was My Little Pony. This time is Star Wars. If you want to hear the whole series, we do have a link in the show notes. You can check that out. And I, of course, highly recommend it. So go ahead, do that. Today, well, every day, I'm Joshua Noel, but today I'm joined by the one, the only, the host of your favorite Baptist-led, Bible-themed podcast, Christian Ashley, host of Let Nothing Move You. I was listening to it earlier, so I'm just kind of geeking out on that lately, and I had to pump you up a little bit. And I'm also here with one of our two newest hosts, the one and only, the only villain, I think. When we're looking at the avatars, I think he's the only bad guy avatar on our logo, is Adam Behr, whose avatar is was it Snipely Snipes? That is not right.
Snidely Whiplash.
Snidely. Okay, there he is. I knew there was something like a word like that there, but I wasn't fully sure what it was. So, like I said, huge topic today. So we're going to jump straight into it. Guys, we're going to go all through Star Wars. And as always, when we're talking about the movies, you have to figure out, and the show's everything, what order do you talk about Star Wars in? Do you start at the very beginning with the Dawn of the Jedi and the Jedi? Today, I don't think we're going to talk about that at all. But do you start with the prequels? Do you start with the original series, the sequels? Do you skip the prequels, as I tend to do? Who knows? Today, we're going to start with the original trilogy. We're going to go back to the Old Republic. Then we're going to jump to the prequels. Then we're going to jump to the sequels. And actually, no, before the sequels, we're going to do some of that in between stuff when they're rebuilding after the Empire, looking at Ahsoka, Mandalorian, that kind of stuff. And lastly, we'll talk about the sequels. That'll probably take the least amount of our time because I feel like it had less politics in it than the other series, which is something I hadn't noticed until I tried to prepare for this. There was a few things I hadn't noticed. There was that, and there's the surprising little amount I knew about the Trade Federation in the prequels. I actually had a message. Our friend Brandon was like, dude, do you know anything about the Trade Federation at all? It was a struggle, but we are going to start with the original trilogy, the Empire and the Rebels. You see it in Rogue One. You see it in the actual trilogy itself. The Empire and the Rebels both have a degree of politics. How is it ran? The Empire is very kind of like federal kind of mindset of all of the planets, all of the countries, whatever needs to be under one rule and are going to, help each other, which always leads to dictatorship, especially when you're talking about movies made in the 70s and 80s. And then that's versus the Rebels, who also had to kind of come together and discuss one another. When we're looking at some of these scenes, especially when we're looking at I loved Rogue One. When you're looking at Rogue One and you see this whole thing of these people coming together, and there were leaders. There were people from the prequels who showed up, who kind of organized how are we going to go against the Empire. And that kind of organization and formation is what politics are. So I thought it was really interesting to see that played out, not only in Rogue One, but especially when we're talking about our favorite original series. It's just good guys versus bad guys. And if you notice, our main people that we follow, with the one exception being Princess Leia, the main people we follow are kind of not really part of any system, right? Han Solo, Luke, Chewbacca, they weren't really part of the organized rebellion. They were people from outside the system coming in. And I think that's pretty on par for what people in the 70s and 80s were looking for, that kind of fight the man mentality. I have talked a lot, so I'm going to throw it over to Christian, I'm going to throw it to Adam this time, actually. Could you break down who is the Empire? Who are the rebels? And for anyone who hasn't seen Star Wars before, like, what exactly are we talking about? What's going on in this original trilogy?
Well, for people that aren't familiar with the original trilogy, it's based around two warring factions, the Empire and the Rebels. And the Empire is basically the later stages of the Roman Empire, when Caesar has taken over using political powers, using the threat of war to kind of, I lost my train of thought for a second, to kind of centralize power around him, and has now become a dictator and is now oppressing the people. And so the Rebel Alliance then comes in in the attempts to overthrow it. And it's just basically, it starts off as a ragtag small group of factions kind of unifying under one flag to try to overthrow a dictatorship and a power, and fight back any way they can. What was the other part of the question? Where are we the state of? Remind me again. What was the other part of the question? I can't hear you.
You're just breaking down who the Empire and Rebels are right now.
Yes. Okay. I just broke it. Did I broke it down? I broke it down. There we go.
Yeah. So when we're looking at that, we mentioned a lot of this stuff, but that attitude of fight the man, of maybe we need people outside the system to kind of come in and save the day from all of the broken systems of the Empire, from the rebels who clearly aren't getting the job done. How do we feel about this kind of mentality of just, we want people outside the system to be the people leading the system? Christian, you go ahead and start this one off.
Well, it's a very idealized form of wanting someone who doesn't desire power to be in charge, because ideally the person who doesn't want to be in charge is someone who would rule a little fairly, versus someone who seeks after that power, versus someone who wants to be in the spotlight. Now, that's not always 100%. There are plenty of people out there who are ambitious and desire to have power, desire to lead others and get the work done. But as time goes on, as you grow up, you kind of learn, not everyone who says that why they came in here was for the benefit of others is really doing that. So it really appeals, well, if these guys who say they're going to help me are not doing it, well, what if I pick someone who doesn't want to be there?
Yeah, I think that's pretty on par. And I feel like anytime you're not satisfied with the system, and sometimes there's genuine causes to do this, but I think anytime you're not satisfied with the system, people tend to try to find a way to blame the system instead of themselves, and sometimes I think it might even be 50-50. A lot of the times, the system fails you, right? The system messed up. The system is why you're in this situation. A lot of the times it's on us, and we still want to blame the system. It's, I work 10 hours a week, and why is food so expensive? Maybe work more and you can afford the food, dude. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. But I feel like no matter what's causing it, if you don't like the situation you're in, you're most likely going to blame the system. And I think that leads to this mentality of wanting heroes that are then coming from outside the system. Adam, what do you think about all this?
I keep thinking back to this. I know we're talking about Star Wars, but I keep thinking about this really great episode of Doctor Who. And in the episode, you have the Zygons and the humans fighting over the space. And there's this whole conversation between he has this two boxes in front of them, and it's a small scale small scale model of war. But the long story short is he's confronting the Zygons. What are you going to do after you win? What are you going to do once you've gained all the power and you've changed the system? How are you going to prevent the next rebellion? How are you going to prevent the next people from coming up? And, when we talk about the dangers of thinking about the system as the problem, that's one of the dangers we have to worry about, is this constant cycle. And we're seeing it so much in our culture today. Our culture is constantly trying to find some cause to fight against, some battle to win, some good versus evil. And I think there's some really interesting parallels there.
Yeah, and we'll get to some of this later too, but what I find fun about all of this is usually the people who are cheering for those outside of the system, their end goal still is to just have a new system. And what you'll end up seeing in Star Wars is a lot of times the new system has the same problems. And I think that's true in the real world as well, right? Like a lot of times it's, we don't want welfare, we don't want this, but what do we want? Well, I want people like me to be getting taken care of, which ends up looking like welfare and this. It's like one of the polls I find really interesting is how many people were against not the federal welfare plan, but for Obamacare. And then they find out that it's the same thing. And it's just so interesting to see those kind of studies of like, yeah, you're not actually against it. You're against the other side because you don't like what's happening. And you don't, I don't know. I think it's important that we think out our policies and think about why did the things previously not work? And that's one of those things that, of course, the original trilogy was made before the prequels, but that's one of the things that I thought was interesting in the original series. Now, when you watch it, is, man, so much of what's going on is the same stuff that the Republic did. And it's like, these problems seem similar. They kind of are rhyming, and no one's learning from their past, which is interesting. And that's where some of your like extra canonical stuff, some of your legend stuff, even some of our video games and comics, I think come in handy, because a lot of that gets way before the prequels. We get a little bit more history and we see exactly how far back does this cycle go and where did it start. Unfortunately, I don't know a ton about that stuff. So I'm going to throw it to our main man, Christian. Tell us some about the Old Republic.
So when we talk Old Republic, we're talking about a very long amount of time. Like in Old Canon, it was 25,000 years where there's been a form of a republic. There's been a form of a Jedi Order. And there's been shakeups every now and then. The Sith would rise up again, or there'd be a rebellion within, or a religious crusade would rise up, like with the Pious Day. And there's a lot to cover. So just for the sake of simplicity, Old Republic that I started getting into would be in the Knights of the Old Republic video games and the comics, where once again, the Sith have risen up. The Republic is fighting against them. Before this, they had a war fighting off the Mandalorians. And now everyone's wondering, okay, who do we side with here? Is it Sith are going to bring order to a republic that has none, because it's just so widespread that it's next to impossible to govern everything well, to know what the left hand is doing with the right hand's over here. It's very much, in a sense, one of the reasons why, if you look at our history for the Roman Empire, why they split up between the Western and the Eastern Roman Empire, to have two separate emperors essentially ruling the same thing. But then you had someone who could specialize here, and had someone who could specialize here. And that had come up with its checks and balances and its failings as well. But over time, the Republic, as time went on, kept getting more greedy, kept getting more distant from the people it was supposed to represent. And even, I'm not that familiar with the High Republic era. I've tried to get into it a couple of times, but it just doesn't jive with me. But it's really like the Jedi are kind of at the height of their power there, but we also start seeing some of the cracks forming of them being more, not slaves to the Republic's policy, but more, what's the word I'm looking for here? Not standoffish, more complacent. And along the lines, that's one of the things that Sidious is able to take advantage of to where we get to the prequel trilogy and him to take control eventually.
Thinking of like the Old Republic stuff and just all of that. Well, one of the things I find interesting too is I haven't read too much of the stuff, as I mentioned. One of the things I did like, and we actually talked about on the show, or I mean you and TJ, the Darth Bane stuff. A lot of the times, the stories that I've heard from the older times at Star Wars revolve more around the villains than the good guys. For whatever reason, I know Revan had a lot of doing like, good guys kind of messed up some stuff with the Mandalorians. There's a whole ordeal there. And you guys talked about that as well. But with Bane, what I thought was interesting is he realized what was messing up the Sith was basically that they were evil. And then he came up with a polity, a form of politics that he thought would solve the issue by there only ever being two Sith. So I thought it was interesting that even he's like, yeah, we're evil. And because we're evil, we need politics so that we can continue being evil and it'll work.
And because it was that inevitable, well, someone's going to want to be in charge. And the Brotherhood of Darkness, which is the one that were fighting the new Sith Wars for like 1,000 years before this, their whole idea was, oh, they recognize the fact that we keep killing the people who are competent. So let's just all say we're equals amongst each other, even though this guy is going to be higher than. And Bane's like, that doesn't work either. So let me create a system where I have me who has the power, wields it, and then have an apprentice who craves it. And that is eventually, it takes 1,000 years, but it takes down the entire Republic, which is an entire galaxy's worth of a form of government.
Yeah. Also, you mentioned how the Republic worked. You were kind of explaining them all having representation, all that kind of stuff. I just want to remind everybody, just for kicks and giggles, America isn't a democracy. It's a democratic republic. Just a fun fact. It's just one of those things that even overseas in states everywhere, people just have this misconception of, well, how come the person with the most votes didn't win? It's because we're not a democracy. That's why. Moving on. Christian, the question I have for you mentioned the Jedi were at the peak of their power. Were the Jedi and the Republic always tied to one another?
It's one of those things, like over time, it just kind of became a mutually beneficial agreement that in the old canon, I don't know how they've handled it in the new canon, after the new Sith War, like the Republic has won thanks to the Jedi's help, after Lord Khan is killed in the thought bomb, the Jedi start taking more of a peacekeeping role, even though they did it before. But the Republic kind of demilitarized after a while because, oh, well, if we just have this object of, oh, we're the ones with the power, we can send our gunships and our ships to attack your planet whenever we want, then we just look like the bad guys. Versus, oh, we send a Jedi instead to parlay on our behalf. Well, now we're looking pretty good. Like we are being very reasonable here. And if you can't listen to a Jedi, then you're in the wrong. And we blatantly see that, like in the opening of Phantom Menace.
Yeah, well, and especially when you consider the fact that originally the Jedi, later known as the Jedi, were supposed to be the balance keepers. They weren't supposed to be all the good side or all the bad side. They were supposed to be those keeping the balance of the Force. And then you see them slowly, because of how people were abusing the dark side, different stuff, becoming more just, we're going to eliminate threats. We're going to eliminate bad. And then, of course, they're going to want to protect people. So they kind of end up more and more justifying this kind of team up with the Republic until we get to the prequel trilogy. And when we're there, there's going to be spoilers. If you haven't seen it, it's on you. The Emperor is kind of behind the scenes, and he's pulling everyone's strings. And the way he's doing it is directly through the politics of that time. So what we end up seeing pretty early on is him. He has a Sith apprentice, but he is communicating with what's called the Trade Federation. And when doing this, he's kind of explaining to them, oh, yeah, you can get more money and we'll give you protection. And he's playing on their desires and using that. And then also you find out later on that he's playing the Republic to feel threatened by what they're doing so that everyone feels threatened. Polarization runs amok, and he's able to basically provide protection on both sides until polarization splits so far that it enables someone to step in as the single dictator. Adam, I'm going to throw it back to you. Could you explain who the Trade Federation is, what's going on in the prequels when we're talking about the Senate, the Jedi, the Trade Federation, Sith, all of that?
Oh, that's a lot. That was well, the shorthand, when we open up to episode 1, we have the Trade Federation, which their main goal is to monopolize and to organize the trading amongst the systems. They weren't a really military power, but they had their robots and things for protection. And they were ultimately just a tool for Sidious. But the events of the events of episode 1 lead into the separatist units, these different organizations that are really unhappy with the Republic that then unite to try to fight the Republic. And there's a really great series of episodes in the Clone Wars TV show where Ahsoka is hanging out with some separatists, and you can kind of see the other side of things. And it's a really interesting conversation. But the shorthand version of it all is you have the Republic, which is the major fort of ultimate power, and then you have Sidious just undermining it, creating discord among smaller governing bodies, and those smaller governing bodies then unite under the flag of the Separatists to try to combat the Republic. And it's so, and I give Lucas so much credit because of the mirroring of everything. The Separatists almost mirror the Separatists and Republic War so much mirrors the Rebellion and the Empire War, you know what I mean, and the things that they stand for, and it's all really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I give Lucas a lot of credit for the prequels as well. That's when I started disliking Lucas a little bit. Sorry, I understand why people love the prequels. I do appreciate some of what's come out of it, but they're just not my favorite movies. But I do find this thing fascinating about the Senate and all this. You talked about the separatist and how they were displeased with what's going on in the Senate. First off, was that about Jar Jar?
I mean, everything negative usually involves Jar Jar at some point. Like, it's so synonymous. I mean, I don't know what that man was thinking. I know it was probably marketing, but it's just like, and I think that's the biggest issue with the sequel trilogies is he had a lot more creative control. We forget how much credit goes to other people in the original trilogy. You know, his wife had a huge input. All these people had so much more input in the story. And in this, the prequel trilogy, he was flying a little bit more solo, and that's where you get things. But to his credit, he saw how much people didn't like Jar Jar, and so he kind of shoved him and made everything his fault, which is kind of funny if you think about it. But yes, it's all Jar Jar's fault.
Yeah, so, you know, I'm known as Josh with the wrong opinions. My wife usually also makes fun of me about that, but this is one wrong opinion our whole household holds. We love Jar Jar here. My wife has a tattoo of Darth Vader and keeps talking about getting a matching one of Jar Jar. They're like, do it. He's the best. And I know he's the worst, but I love him. Adam, what is the actual thing that's going on with the Separatists? Because you mentioned them, but I don't quite know if everybody knows who they are.
Well, the Separatists, like I said, was an organization made up of all these different smaller systems that were unhappy with the Republic. And Dooku kind of came out of the woodworks and is like, hey, if you're unhappy with the Republic, we're creating this new organization, this new Senate, this almost a new republic to counteract against the Republic. And we're doing it with, an army of robots. They worked with the Trade Federation, the Banking Guild, a couple, I can't remember all the names of everyone they worked with, but they organized with these big corporations almost to align themselves with these smaller systems in order to take back territory away from the Republic because they weren't happy with the process. Because as we learned from the prequel trilogies, the Republic was functional, but there was a lot of systems and things not getting their needs met. Of course, there was corruption in the Senate, and the irony, the question is, was the corruption there because of Sidious, or did Sidious feed off the corruption? And it's very good stuff. But what's so amazing about the Separatists is they were actually being, they were led by Dooku, who was Sidious's apprentice, who we realized is actually Emperor Palpatine. So it was literally two sides being played against the middle to generate power. And that's why, I mean, you say what you want about the sequel trilogies. At the end of Attack of the Clones, when you see the clone troopers marching onto the ships and you got the Empire theme going and there's Palpatine just staring over and you're like, he has literally started a war between, he literally created a problem so that he could fix it, so that he could take power. I mean, it was brilliant. It's brilliant writing. It's brilliant storytelling. It was so good. So good.
Yeah, either way, he won.
Yeah. I think that particular part of the Emperor was good. I still have to maintain that most of the story writing for the prequels were pretty bad. But that's just me, just my opinion. One thing that there's a lot of things that stand out that interest me, but I'm going to pivot a little bit into some Bible for a second here. And this is fun because I think both of you are probably on the same side as far as like inerrancy, the Bible as literal kind of stuff. I'm a little bit more like inerrant light is probably what I would call myself. I find it interesting when you hear where there's part of the Bible where the Israelites are asking for a king. It's like, well, do you know some are going to be evil, some are going to be good? And it's like, okay, but we want one anyway. So God gives them a bad king and then a good king. And, there's a whole cycle goes on. But if you look before that point in the Bible, there are all these judges, and judges are described as having ruled over people. And some of them were good and some of them were terrible. So it's kind of like, well, what's the difference of the judges and the kings? One of the differences for me that I find really interesting, if you pay attention, most of the judges, maybe all, but I'm not sure, so I'm going to say most, weren't over all of Israel. God would appoint a judge to come save a few of the tribes. So in a way, they were like a theocratic republic, if you're looking through the book of Judges. Now, I'm curious on y'all's take on that, and also, I'll throw it to Christian first so he can say, how are the judges different than the kings? Because if you're going to see the Bible as literal and all that, I feel like you still need to explain that a little bit of why God was like, no, you don't want that, when there were good and bad judges that God sent before the king.
Yeah, sure. I'll take it. Because the judges, they weren't supposed to rule all of Israel. You brought that out as a point. Their goal was to defend an Israel that had lost its way and to show them guidance, because the people who were supposed to be technically in charge were the priests, were the Levites. Their job was to gather all of Israel together in their own tribes that they were at and have them worship the Lord. They were supposed to have them make the sacrifices. They were supposed to have them do the festival days and look after one another and teach them the law. But more often than not, what happened is they didn't do their job. And the people slipped away because there was no structure there anymore. It's like, oh, well, if the priests stopped caring, well, why should I care either? So then God would raise up a judge after he allows, the Arameans or the Edomites or the Philistines or the Midianites, what have you, to attack Israel. And then a judge would come, fight for a bit, and then give some judging and every bit of that, but not take full control, because God was ultimately supposed to be the one in control, and he was supposed to be represented by his priests who failed at their job.
This question was so I could set up a different question, by the way. But Adam, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Like, what are the differences between the judges and the kings or anything? Or do you think Christian hit it pretty much on the nose?
I think you hit it pretty much on the nose. I think the other thing that I think is always important when we're talking about the Old Testament and the judges is we forget that so much of the Old Testament law and the judges, it was all about setting the Jewish people apart from the rest of the world. That was God. When we're reading through these things, you can see that God was trying to distinguish his people from the rest of the world. And we've incorporated a lot of these philosophies into our system, like the philosophies of how we treat our spouses and things, which are dictated in the Old Testament. Some of that was kind of new for people to hear about, the way we treat people. Some of those concepts of the Old Testament law were very new and very odd to the Jewish people at the time, because they were, God was trying to separate them. And but I think the overarching themes that Christian hit on was spot on.
Okay, so that was he kind of partially answered what I was trying to set up for. The question was more of a question of, so when most of Israel, let's say, when they were being wicked, they were being evil. This is one of my what if questions. What if, one of the tribes, like the Benjamites, were like, you know what, let's be separatists. Let's separate from the rest of Israel because they're being evil. Would God have blessed them for trying to remain holy and separating from the evil that Israel is doing? Or would they have been punished because they were supposed to be one with God's people? That would kind of be my thought process. Just kind of wondering what your take on that is.
So correct me if I'm wrong, this scenario, Benjamites, everyone else is in evil. They are not.
Yeah.
And they're choosing to separate themselves from their other tribe. Okay. Well, they would be counted as righteous because they're following the law. They're following God. But they would be punished if they didn't seek after their brethren and say, guys, you're losing your way. Like, you can't be doing this. And in fact, we kind of see the exact opposite in Judges, of the Benjamites really losing their way, the Israelites losing their way, thinking they're being righteous, and a civil war happens, and a ton of good people, well, not really good people, a ton of people who shouldn't have had to die.
Yeah, and I'm probably pretty much of the same mind, even though part of the law also was to not separate. That, that's what they were supposed to do, which is why I just thought it was an interesting conundrum, because there are in this made up situation, they would be in a place where they're either breaking one part of the law or another part. And it's kind of what's more important, which is why I think Adam's answer earlier really spoke to that of, no, the law existed so that they would be separate from evil, that they would stand out as God's people. So I think in that scenario, yeah, they're separating from evil. That's what the law was there for in the first place. But I think you're right. We saw pretty much the opposite in Judges, which I'm going to move on. But you see them separating because I'm going to sound pretty progressive here, probably, because God's law and stuff was a little bit too hard, more or less. It was, they have to worship their God. They have to follow a certain way. The people around them were getting drunk and playing with prostitutes for their gods, all this other stuff. And their law was a little bit more constraining. And what you saw, instead of, them separating from the evil Israel and becoming good, the Benjamites, a lot of the other tribes, were actually separating to go towards these other people who it looked like their laws were a little bit easier. They didn't have to give a tenth of their wealth to support priests and poor people, right? They got to hold on to all their wealth. It was easier to become rich in some of these other nations. And that was really tempting. So they separated to become part of that, because politically it didn't make sense for them to remain part of the nation. And they're kind of putting their politics over the law of God in those scenarios. And that's when they became separatist, which is pretty close to a lot of what we're talking about in the Star Wars world. Even if it wasn't, the righteous republic or anything like that, it was people trying to become separated from the republic to get wealthy off of the Trade Federation a lot of times. I think. Is that right? You guys probably know the prequels better than I, because I avoid a lot of it.
Well, what's interesting about this concept of the republic is in our minds, we think, we forget that the actual centers of power in that universe was all evil. I mean, even the founders of the Trade Federation, we realize, even the founders of the Separatists, was an evil group of people, and they were all taking advantage of, the poor and the downtrodden, the separate, and they were both more obsessed with their own power and their own political thing. So it's hard to really say that either side in the movies was good or bad. I think, for a story-wise, Lucas focused on the Republic seeming a little bit more good than the Separatists. But when they dived into the series, the Clone Wars series, you really kind of be like, no, it's two powers taking advantage of the weak for their own power and things.
Yeah, and that's part of what I really liked about the Clone Wars series too, was they really highlight that. Sorry, Christian.
No, you're good. I mean, if you want to stay biblical, this is kind of like a David versus Absalom situation here.
Oh, yeah.
Not that David is wholly the Republic, Absalom is totally the Separatist, but to get that sense of, he's not getting everything you need, Absalom would say, well, if I were king, if I were in charge, I would give you everything you need. I would look after you. And of course, he's saying what they want to hear. So that's what the Separatists did. They were being downtrodden. They did not have the money. They did not have the protection that they wanted, or the representation that they wanted. Didn't mean as much as someone from, say, a core world, like Corellia or something like that. And it's just bad people taking advantage of something that, if better people were in charge, something could be done that didn't have to result in a war.
I'm going to get real controversial before we move on here. And I'm going to have to put an asterisk here and tell everybody, I do think the Confederate was a worse evil. Way, 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 way worse. Very glad that the Confederacy lost the Civil War. But if you're looking at the American Civil War, both sides were still bad guys. I mean, you either had one side that was trying to, if we're being realistic, trying to say, hey, we want to keep slaves because slaves good for money. And the other side saying, we don't care how much you'll suffer. We want to rip you of your slaves and then offer nothing to help you survive afterwards. Both of those sides are evil. One is clearly more evil, but you can't act like one was the good guys. That's just not what was happening. And I think that's where...
Well, that's one. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and that's where you see all wars. I think that's the case. That's where I think the Zygon thing earlier was really helpful. Regardless of where you see war, fiction or not, there's usually not a good guy. There's usually a less bad guy.
Yeah, well, that's one of the important things, in school. Sorry. Like, you're good, Adam. It's we start off soft and like, hey, American Revolution, we're the good guys. We rebelled because we wanted representation. The taxation was bad. And yes, those are all objectively true. But it's not like we were some paragon of truth and justice and the American way. Like, that's never been a thing because Superman doesn't exist. And, like, as time goes on, we should also teach our students, okay, we started here, like we rebelled 1775, ratified in 1776, everything we needed there for Declaration of Independence. Let's also talk about the fact that we invaded Canada. Let's also talk about the fact that, we were split because of slavery. And that nuance doesn't come in. We just stay good guy, good guy, good guy, bad guy, bad guy, bad guy, versus actually introducing like, hey, over time, these are people and people are screwed up, even when they're doing good things.
Adam, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna add into the point. The common misconception is that anything we do is good. The reality is, and the Bible is clear about it, God is the definer of what is good. God is the definer of what is just and what is right. And we all fall short of that glory. And, as much as, I am very proud to be American, I'm so grateful to be in this country and have been born and raised here. But it's still not God's nation. It's still not God's country. It might
Amen.
be inspired
Hallelujah.
by God. It may be pointed towards God. And we pray every day that our nation is a nation that goes towards God and not away from God. But we are not citizens of this nation. We are citizens of God's kingdom. And so we always look at this lens like maybe there's times in our history where we might have been more right than other times. But we will always be evil in comparison to God's glory. And that's really important to remember that.
Yeah. And I might occasionally raise questions how much we were inspired by God or any of that stuff. But all in all, yeah, I agree. We're not God's nation. We are not citizens of this nation. I mean, I am, but I am primarily a citizen of the city of God. Or so you should definitely read Augustine's City of God. I think it's super important, even though it's one of the longest works out there. It's important. There's abridged versions on Audible. If that's all you can do, do it. Christian, you unmuted. Were you going to say
with
something?
your time? No, I was just going to agree with you. Read City of God.
Yeah. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and move forward in the prequels. And yes, most of our times are spent in the prequels. It's the most political of all of the Star Wars, I think. I want just a couple of quick questions. First, I want to point out before this question, one thing I think is really interesting. The Trade Federation had a seat in the Senate. They were the bad guys. They were, separatists were leaving the Senate to be, part of this kind of thing, all this stuff. And yet the Trade Federation had a seat in the Senate. The Jedi, who were incredibly closely tied to the Republic, never had a seat at the Senate. So why is it, those of you who know better, why did the Trade Federation have a seat, but the Jedi did not have a seat at the Senate?
Well, it points to part of the corruption of the Republic itself is that they allowed an autonomous company, essentially, interstellar company, to come in and have representation versus a world, which is what they're supposed to be representing, is the needs of those people, not the needs of corporation that's would vote for things, obviously, for their benefit versus everyone else. And then you have the Jedi. The reason they weren't involved with a representative in the Senate is because, they're not supposed to. They're supposed to kind of stay not out of politics, but they're not to be the ones making decisions, because as you see in some of the extra canonical things and legends, people get uppity when a bunch of sorcerers make decisions for everyone else. And they can rightfully accuse some of them of, oh, you probably just mind tricked him into getting your policy passed. Or, you could have threatened their family. We'll send a group of Jedi agents there and we can get what we want done. The Republic's doing the exact same thing sometimes, but the Jedi are supposed to be set apart enough to where they're involved, but they're not the ones making the decisions. They're just supposed to be seeking peace and justice in the Republic.
Yeah, so that it's confusing because do you think it's more of a superficial divide that they created where they're like, we want to pretend like we're really not that involved with the Republic, so we're not going to have a seat. That way it's clear that we're not really part of the government. When in reality, the amount of time they were spending with the senators and the government and, discussing, telling people how to vote more or less, they were just as much a part of it as I think as they would be if they were on the Senate.
Yeah. It's that they're trying to create a divide, knowing that they've chosen a side.
Yeah. Adam, anything to add?
Well, what we find the Jedis at this point in the Star Wars universe, and I love it because you see such a difference between the Star Wars of the you see such a difference between the Old Republic Jedis and the film series Jedis. They really are more of an extension of the government than they are a religious organization, and that's part of the divide in things. In the original Old Republic, when they were fighting the Mandalorian War, the Jedis would have never thought of interfering in the war. That's what was so criminal about Revan's rebellion.
Yeah.
The fact that he convinced a bunch of Jedis to go to war was just so not what they were about. But yet in the films, you see a very real lack of hesitation, because by that point in the Star Wars canon, they're closer to the FBI than they are Christians. That's a really poor comparison, but that's illustrating my point.
Yeah. And I think it's really jarring if you watch the Clone Wars cartoon. You get to, there's a whole saga where they're on the planet Mandalore, and you see how involved they are. And if you have the story of Revan in the back of your mind, you're like, wait, what? It's like, huh? So I thought it was interesting. And I think a lot of those decisions, they kept getting closer and closer to the Republic, closer and closer to tying themselves to the government. The more they felt the Sith were attached to the Federation, the more they felt like the Sith was attached to the Separatists. I feel like they justified getting closer to one political party because this other religious group that they didn't like was getting closer to another political party. And I think that ultimately polarization and fear is what led to the Emperor being able to completely take over. And you have the iconic line here. I'm going to throw it up. This is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause. Christian, unpack for us. How did we get to this line? How did we get to where this happens?
Yeah. It's Palpatine, plain and simple. The man is a born manipulator. And he had the Jedi. He had the Republic. He had his constituents on Naboo. He had the Sith. Well, guess what? Because he is a Sith, all played against each other while he's got multiple apprentices here, just in case this one screws up, or just in case I find a better one here, or I'm also grooming Anakin here. Also, he can be the one in charge. Well, either way, he would have won if the Separatists had taken over Coruscant and then won the war at the start of Episode 3. Well, guess what? Darth Sidious this whole time, Dooku would have bowed down before him and said, "This is your true leader. I've just been his representative." But it doesn't turn out that way. It turns out to where the Republic wins, only to lose itself, thinking they're helping themselves because, oh no, if the Jedi, these people we're supposed to trust and watch out for us, can rebel against our government, well, they could have killed me. But then Palpatine, now our new emperor, saved us all. So I have to look to him for guidance here. He's the one who saved us from that threat.
Yeah. And that's where we're not going to get too much into it, but a lot of the stuff in like Andor and some of those series that happened in between prequels and the original series get really interesting because you see exactly the repercussions of putting all their faith in the leader that saved them. It's not great. It's not great. Even before the original trilogy, when it's full on Emperor, it's still not good. And it's just, it's fascinating. When you turn to government to save you, I think that's what happens. And when you let fear and polarization consume you, that's what happens. And, it's what we talked about earlier. When you're so afraid of the current establishment, you blame everything on the current system, whether you're separatist, whether you're a Republic, and you just had to, I get to do my utilitarian rant. They justified having an emperor because it was going to beat the bad guys. And they were like, oh, it's worth it because we know the end result. Well, guess what? They didn't know the end result. It's why utilitarianism is stupid. You don't know what's going to happen unless you are God. You do not know what's going to happen. So it's like, yeah, just do the right thing. But that's not what they did, right? They let fear, they let polarization consume them. So I guess the question then becomes, hey, the polarization, I think, was just going to happen. As long as there's fear, that's going to happen. How much of it is to blame on the Jedis pairing themselves so closely with the Republic? Should they have just only went after the Sith, ignored the political aspect of it all, and just kept to their own belief? Or were they right in going after, becoming part of the government, and this was just inevitable?
Well, they'd be fools not to be involved at all. Because, if you're going to represent someone's interests, you got to be aware of what they're doing and what they want to happen. So if you totally isolate yourself from that and just show up every now and then just to do what they tell you to do, well, are you really doing your job? You're not vetting anyone. You're just kind of there. But then that becomes, well, how close is too close? It's that sense of how can I be part of this world, but not of this world at the same time? How do I represent Christ well, love other people, and yet not give in to evil, not say, oh, it's okay what you're doing, just for the sake of peace or a false sense of peace? And it's one of those questions that's not easy to answer because there's so many issues you have to consider. So I don't think the Jedi never should have isolated themselves from everyone, but they also got too close for their own good. Where is that line? I don't know.
I'm going to push back at them. Let Adam push. I don't think they got too close for their own good. I think they aligned themselves too much. I think the Jedi themselves fell for the polarization. If the Jedi would have been just as close and attacked both the Senate and the Federation and the Separatists, called everyone out for where they were wrong, instead of only calling out one side, I think it might have done more good. Maybe. I don't know. George Lucas was directing. Adam, what are your thoughts on all this?
They lost before they were done before the show, before the movie film even began. I love the Darth Plagueis book that came out some years ago. It's really good. It kind of shows you what was happening. The Jedi were done before any of this happened. And if you've watched the Chronicles of the Jedi, where you get to see Dooku's kind of fall, the problem was the Jedis had become so comfortable with their situation. They had become so comfortable with their responsibilities and their connection to the Force that they were so easily able to be blinded by Sidious to the point where they were standing in front of one of the most powerful Sith Lords in their history, in their timeline, and they couldn't see him. They didn't even see him. It was, so it was one of those situations. It was done before it even begun, because by the time we see Phantom Menace, Palpatine already has everything in place. Everything is already ready to go. You know what I mean? Everything is already in order, and it had been decades in the making. It's like the only way it would have stopped is if someone just was able to see through Sidious' disguise, and no one was able to. Yeah. So I don't think there's anything they could have done.
Yeah. Well,
there's also something too. Sorry, Josh, to interrupt you. There, in old canon, there was a comic that released. I want to say it was like Star Wars Republic or something like that. And you had two members of the Jedi say, "Oh, well, we know there's a Sith Lord in the Senate. Let's run midichlorian tests on the people there." And Palpatine's like, because they came to him first, thinking he's on their side, going, "Oh, that's brilliant." But then he kind of does a Uriah on them and sends them on the front lines. That idea is quickly swept under the rug. No one cares about it anymore.
Yeah, and honestly,
there are people who tried. Sorry.
No, I was going to say that adds to the point I was going to make. So, bravo. I think what it comes down to it is the Jedi needed an equally good politician. When you look at the Emperor, in my opinion, he had a few cool fight scenes, right? He kind of did okay against Yoda. But I think the scariest thing about him wasn't, he was a really good fighter. I think if the whole Jedi Council just had a straight fight with him, they would have won. The scariest part of Palpatine was he was a good politician. right? Like, think about what he did to convince so many people to do exactly what he wanted. What he did with the clones, what he did with the Jedi and convincing them to be part of the Republic, more or less, without getting a vote themselves. He was a good politician, which is scary. Like, politics can be a lot more threatening than lightning coming from your fingertips, you know? Like, actually, when you think about it, that might have been as scary as power. But he does get defeated twice, unfortunately. After he's defeated the first time after the original trilogy, we have a few shows and different stuff now that went between the original trilogy and the sequels I want to look at, one of which being Ahsoka. For those of us recording, we've seen 2 episodes. For those of you watching, have seen far more at this point because, yeah, we're releasing this the day of the second Republican presidential debate. We recorded this shortly after the first one, so, you know. But one of the things that was interesting in Ahsoka so far, and you see it in a lot of these shows, is you have them trying to figure out how do we build up. And I really liked where you saw, her name's Hera, right?
Syndulla? Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, you saw her as a general. She went in and one of the facilities, and you find out that a lot of the people who work there are actually the same people from the Empire. They don't care whose side it is. And it turns out they do. But it's interesting because you even saw that in that one-off episode of The Mandalorian. A lot of what's running the Republic are people from the Empire because it was so massive and so consuming. They couldn't figure out how to run it without that. I was going to throw this to Adam, but I'm not sure if he's here anymore. So I'm going to throw it to Christian. What's going on in the big void after the Emperor falls? How do we see the new Republic trying to build? What does it look like for these people to try to create their own government now?
Well, we see the difficulties with that. Governments aren't created in the span of a day, and they're dealing with an empire that, for all its flaws, did have a sense of control over an entire galaxy that the Republic didn't. Obviously, they did it through very underhanded and evil methods. But how did they, representing better ideals, do it? Well, one thing we had to learn through history is that when West and East Germany were separated, we had on West Germany, the Allies were trying to create a government there, but there just weren't as many capable people around to represent the German people within their sphere of influence because A, they'd either been killed or they'd gone underground, or they were afraid of, the Nazis rising up again or something like that, or the Soviets coming in and taking over their country. So one of the things that we were forced to do, for better or worse, is there were still alive Nazis. And we allowed some of them in positions of power in West Germany and West Berlin and stuff like that, because it was either that or send untested people in there. And you can argue either way what was the right decision there. But the point is, we look at Germany now, after years, it's unified and it's brought up for stuff like that. So the Republic needed capable people who knew what they were doing because they'd been doing it for a while.
Yeah. And that was, that was part of the problem. Well, I'm going to do this a few different ways. After World War I, Germany was put in a terrible spot. That's part of why Hitler was able to rise and do everything he did that caused World War II. If you look currently at a lot of our problems in America, it's just slowly grown, even going back to the Civil War, where you see the South was put financially in not the best spot afterwards. And they have always blamed the North. And it's turned into, instead of South and North problem, it's become rural and country problem, but it's still that same thing. It's the tension in America, really, if you look at it, revolves a lot more around wealth and where's the money at than anything. And I think that's usually the problem. Well, there's a ton of problems with war, but usually that's the problem post-war is who has the money at the end, because someone feels bitter, someone feels gypped. One thing I find interesting, I kind of want to get Adam's opinion on, a lot of these characters in between the original and sequel trilogy, where we're getting some of these shows and stuff come out. Look at The Mandalorian. I just want to call him Jin, but I know he has a last name. Anyway, you see his character. Yeah, he was hurt by what happened on Mandalore. He was saved by Mandalorians, and that kind of is his defining thing. Is he was hurt by what happened with the war, and now he's rebuilding himself. And he ends up rebuilding a whole family, if you're looking at it now throughout the season 3. Ahsoka, her whole story is being hurt by the Jedi and their rules and basically having her version of church hurt, right? And she goes through this whole deconstruction. And now we have the show where she's trying to remember who she is, try to rebuild herself. And at the same time, we're seeing a republic try to rebuild after all of this damage that happened from the Empire. And we're left with, how do you heal after this kind of trauma? Whether it's galactic, whether it's church hurt, whether it's you just deconstructed and you don't know who you are. Like, an identity crisis can be a trauma, I think, personally. And you're just left with these questions of, how do we rebuild? So Adam, what is your answer? How do we rebuild? How does the New Republic come back from this?
Well, I mean, it's a different answer for real life and then for television. So
okay.
For when it comes to the New Republic, there really isn't anything that I would say that they aren't already doing. The problem with any of these situations is, human evil people are going to do human evil things. You have these people that, we see it in The Mandalorian, how there's this bureaucracy to just try to get some pilots to go deal with a really important issue. All these approval stamps have to be approved just to get something done. You know what I mean? And we see that in our own republic, our own society now. So, they maybe the government of the New Republic might be a little bit kinder, might be a little bit on better footings, but it's still falling into the same traps that the previous republic had, and even the Empire had. You know what I mean? Because like I said, human evil people are going to do human evil things. Now, when it comes to our own life, when it comes to the reality of having the situation where you are church hurt, where you do have this broken society, well, first of all, I mean, we must always point back to God. If you really want to rebuild your life, I'm at the point in my life where the amount of people that have gone through trauma or gone through tragedy and have rebuilt their life without God, in my opinion, is so much smaller than the people that have done that, who have rebuilt their life with God. Yeah, there is the power of this human will that can overcome these things. And, you see some people that look like they have all their lives together. But I just know what I've needed in my life and what I've seen so many need is, when you're really trying to rebuild your life after tragedy, after loss, the best and most effective way is through Christ.
Yeah, I gotta see. I agree. I do find it interesting, though, in my own life. I'm just thinking about who I hear complain the most and who seems to have it all together the most. Usually the people in churches are the ones that are complaining more, and the people I know who aren't really religious tend to be a little bit more at ease with the world. But that's just in my own life. I do know there's a lot of this, especially when you look at like actual psychological studies and all that kind of stuff. And when you look at like even just how AAs ran, right? How people go through trauma centers. What do they tell you? They tell you need some belief in a higher power, whether it's God or not. They usually will say it doesn't have to be God because they can't push a religion on you. But there's a reason they say you need something of a higher power, because we are created to rely on something like that. And that's why I believe that thing to be God. And I think it's, hardwired into us. And I think it's really telling. I think my answer, I would also agree when you're not, I wouldn't make the distinction between television and real life. I would make the distinction more like governing bodies and personal people might look different. How you rebuild a government, how you rebuild a group of people might look different than how you yourself rebuild from hurt. One thing that I think that both should share in common, though, and that everybody tends to forget, you shouldn't immediately react. You shouldn't immediately overcorrect. You need to give time for healing. And what do I mean by that? How many people, I'm going to get super controversial because I need to be specific. In your own life, now I'll do a specific example from personal lives and from a government here thing in America. I'm not going to do too specific, but I think it's important to look at. Personally, how many people I know that experienced church hurt and then never went to church again because someone wronged them? I'm like, listen, not that you overreacted. Trauma is real, but I think what happened was you immediately responded and maybe corrected too much. Maybe you should go to a church with a single person leading everything and no checks and balances. But maybe that doesn't look like not going to a church at all, right? That's my opinion. And when I look at like our government, the amount of people who, they voted not to impeach Trump, and that either makes them a great person or an evil person, depending on what side you're on, right? And I'm like, wait a minute. I know lots of good people who've made really stupid decisions, and I know lots of terrible people who've done stuff that helped me a lot. It's like, how could you just boil everything down to this, and that's what you're going to make your whole opinion off of? And, I don't care what side you're on. I don't think you can look at our nation or other nations like Brazil that have gone through some of the stuff of like leaders who are doing similar things. You can't look at it and say there's not some kind of trauma that we're healing from. There definitely is. There's definitely this polarization that's happening in several countries throughout the world is causing a lot of hurt. And you do need to heal. And I think the best solution maybe isn't to point out who's the bad guys and immediately do something about it. Maybe it's time to give yourself some time to heal. Perhaps. It's just my thought.
Yeah. I'll agree with that totally. I mean, to go back to Star Wars, one of the new canon things that I really don't like that was done, I believe the novel was Aftermath. It's been a while since I've looked at it, is as part of that healing process, Mon Mothma, who becomes leader of this new republic, demilitarizes the new republic. And that's always been one of her things. She's never wanted to be the one in charge of a bunch of ships and people leading people to their deaths. And that's her starting too soon on the process, even though they own most of the galaxy now, but the Empire is still out there and eventually becomes the First Order, who then takes advantage of the fact that they've demilitarized to an extent. Not that they've totally gotten rid of it, but they've gotten to the point of, I can't remember the number exactly. It was like a huge number. And that comes to that point of, we've been fighting a war for so long, like we need rest, we need healing, but is this the right way to go about it? I would say no, obviously with what happens in a sequel trilogy.
Yeah. Well, and then look, I'm trying so hard not to make this just about American politics. Look at like any system. What happens is people have this tendency to forget what you do now. When you're thinking about law, you guys know I want to get into law. When you're thinking about law, whatever you do to make your side win absolutely will be used against you. So pointing to an American example would be how many presidents we get in and immediately reverse everything the last one did. All that does is keep us from ever progressing, because we just have one guy undoing what the last guy did who's going to be replaced by someone who's going to undo what they did, right? And how many of our laws that we're like, well, we want free speech for all of the things that we love as Christians, and then we're going to turn around and get really angry when somebody uses that free speech against us. It's not free speech, but for me and not for thee. You know what I mean? Like I think the system is set up where whatever you do will come back to you. And when you do these over corrections, when you're, I'm really upset of what's going on and how my community was treated, I'm going to make a law about it. A lot of times you don't think of the consequences down the road. And that's what happens here. You have so many things of, we got rid of the Empire and everything they ever did was bad. You look at, the episode of Mandalorian and you see, people who used to work for the Empire, we're not going to let them do this science anymore. We're not going to let them do this anymore. And how that immediately turns back around and hurts their side. And that's always going to be the case. It's why Star Wars will never be settled. That and the fact that they always want to make money. They keep just undoing what the last guy did so that they can be replaced and have that undid again.
Well, we're seeing this in our society right now in real time. We look at the oppression that certain communities have faced, the very real oppression that certain communities have faced in our society. And now you see factions of those groups now turning around and wanting to impose the same oppression on other people. And so, the war against men, really, let's just take the battle of the sexes. We have equality for the most part, between the two sexes, and yet men have such higher suicide rate, and men have such a higher lonely rate, and men are unhappy in marriages and they're unhappy being single, and you have this societal change. It's like in the process of trying to make our society more equal between men and women, men have lost something along the way that they're now trying to find in some trying to find through people on the internet, some people, some of those people are definitely better than others. We're not going to name any names. We'll just let you fill in. But, and so we're seeing that. So in the process of solving one real genuine mistake in our history, the way we treated women, we are now overcorrecting. And now we have this really deep disillusion of men that's causing a huge mental health crisis in our society. Not to try to devalue what women are going through, but one solution is causing another problem, and it's just the same thing when we go back to the Republic and things like that. One, as they solve one problem, they're just creating more and more in its wake.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the women thing in our culture, you do see where this is happening to men. And yet at the same time, you still see a lot of issues of women not getting paid as much, women going through certain things and not necessarily having equity. It's still like we still have a lot of work to do if we're going to have equality among the genders. And yet it seems like we're going about it the wrong way, because rather than lifting up one gender, it seems like a lot of times we're just taking the other down. And one of the things I really liked about the Barbie movie, we're going to just go all over the place today. I enjoyed how it started off in Barbie world where women had all the power, and you saw how damaging that was for Ken. And you saw how that damage caused him to create a world that was damaging for the Barbies. And in the end, one of the things I really liked was it wasn't, oh, Barbies have power, yay, everything's good again. It's, hey, maybe we actually do need to include the Kens. Maybe both are important. And that's one of those things I really liked. Even though it didn't come up with a beautiful solution at the end, it still acknowledged that we can't just tear one side down and think that's going to fix it. And this goes beyond genders. It goes through everything. And that's where one thing I think Star Wars is really good at showing us, that when you just tear one side down, it doesn't solve the problem. Even if that side is the emperor, the evil of all evils, just tearing that down isn't going to make everything better. Which is where
and we have to
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and it was just like what we were talking the other day about Mutant Mayhem. God loved the prostitutes as much as he loved the Pharisees. And we have to remember that Christ loved them both equally, and he wanted the same thing from both of them. And we as Christians have to remember that no matter what side of the political aisle, and I'm guilty of this as much as anyone, taking too strong of a stance on something and too quickly vilifying someone else because they don't share my opinion. I've done that numerous times. I could write a list of all the people I need to apologize to for doing that. But as I got older, I realized, it's important to take these stands, but it's also important to take these stands in a loving, Christ-like way. And that's almost as more important, is doing it in a loving, Christ-like way.
Yeah. I second that. And I know Christian well enough to know he's going to third that with a thumbs up there. There we go. But it leads really well into one thing I did like in the sequel trilogy. I know everybody has their complaints, everyone has their loves, but everyone liked The Last Jedi. I know that for a fact. No one had an issue with that particular movie. I'm joking. I know both of my fellow host here didn't love it. It's one of my favorite Star Wars movies personally. But one of the things that was that I loved in this movie, there was a lot. One of the things I did love, I don't remember this character's name, but there's this guy, DJ, who that's such an easy name to remember. We have a host called TJ. How can I? Okay, anyway, DJ.
Yeah,
he does all kinds of stuff, but he pushes weapons and he sells them not only to the rebels, or not the rebels now. What are they? It's something in the First Order. Is it the New Republic in the First Order? What is the good guys and bad
Resistance.
guys? The Resistance?
Resistance and First Order. Yeah, it's a lame name. It's one of many
Resistance
problems. But continue.
Such a lame. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, the Resistance and the First Order.
Who are they resisting?
We're resisting any challenge to our power.
What does that mean? What does First Order mean?
Yeah, continue.
Remnant was such a better name. In the Legend, sorry to get on a sidetrack. Remnant was the name of the forces of the Empire after in the Legend series. That's such a better name.
Yeah, that's better than First Order. That's better than First Order. A lot of things would be better than Resistance. Anyway, yeah, he wasn't just selling the weapons to the Resistance. He was also selling it to the First Order, the good guys and the bad guys. Why? Because they wanted to make money. And the whole city he's from, they're making money from both sides. They could care less who's winning, good or bad. And part of why I love that is That's how the Emperor won. He didn't care if the Republic won or the Federation. He was going to win either way. And I think in the end, evil wins when polarization wins. When we polarize, that's when the bad guys win. And I think what's cool about the sequel trilogy to me is it wasn't blatant evil that won from polarization. It's the rich get richer, the poor stay poor. And because that's something that's true in real life. You know, as long as we let the politicians push whatever agenda they are and argue about it, and they never do anything about it, we just keep voting and hoping our side wins because eventually that's going to fix it, right? And that keeps the status quo. That's how the rich stay richer. That's where Christian gets to complain about super PACs. Christian, you want to complain about super PACs?
Yes. There are three things I like about The Last Jedi. I like the Porgs, I like the Crystal Foxes, and I like DJ. But not for the reason Joshua likes him. Because I think this is one of the most poorly handled parts of the film, is that idea of, well, everyone's just profiteering off of this right now. We go to Canto Bight, and it's this random casino planet no one's heard of before. And, you know, we see people representing the resistance there. We see people representing the First Order there. We're told, but we're not shown that well. And DJ makes a good point. If we were shown more of that dealing, if Rose and Finn had in the midst of trying to find someone to help them save their people, and you know, time has always been weird in Star Wars, so I can't fault the film for this. They spend all this time here on Canto Bight, then make their way all the way back on a chase scene. It is what it is. And the idea is solid. The execution in the film is flawed. And I would say that about a lot of things there. But I like him because he does represent that idea of, I'm just going to make my way through the world. And if that means I have to pal up with the First Order, I have to pal up with the Resistance, and then I make some credits, like, I don't care. Whoever pays me, that's my side. And in the end, like when Finn and Rose are about to be executed on the whatever the Super Star Destroyer is for that film, if they called it something else, and Finn gives us like generic hero line of like we'll get you, or you'll pay for this, or something like that. And DJ kind of looks at him and says, maybe, and then walks off.
Yeah. One of the other things I liked about DJ, thematically, he is the anti-Harrison Ford. He is the opposite of Han Solo. Han Solo was like, yeah, sure, whoever pays me, that's what side I'm on, blah. But in his heart, in his core, Han Solo was good. And he comes in to save the day. And what's interesting, he was the good guy. Because like we said, the original trilogy, the good guys were those who were outside the system. Here, it's one system versus the other. And this guy who's outside the system is the bad guy. And he's very much the bad guy, right? Like he just, I'm going to sell you. I'm going to screw you guys over because it's going to make me money. And then I'm going to peace out because I got my money. That's all I cared about. And I think it's really interesting how much of a contrast he is to Han Solo's character. One movie after Han passes. Like it wild to me how they did that. But as far as like polarization, once pitting one side versus the other, being how the rich stay richer and how people make money, all that kind of stuff. Adam, did you have anything you wanted to add to that conversation before we get to one more thing before we wrap up?
No, you know, this whole the whole concept of the rich get rich and the poor get poor. I mean, even biblically, when you look at it from the biblical times, it's a story of human history. It's a story of the human progression. You know, we were talking about earlier how we all were, you made a comment about worshiping and how, well, I won't go back there because I'm having a train of thought issue. But what we're seeing today in our political sphere, we can go back all sorts of points throughout history and see that it's the exact same thing. And we have to remember that, that's what's so interesting about life and about even the film Star Wars is, you keep going through these same cycles is because we're so desperate in need of a savior. So it's desperate need in something outside of our system, a being almost that's not made up of time, space, or matter, aka God, to step in and to solve these issues that we keep having because we keep going through the same cycle. We see it with the Israelites. We see it in our society. You see it in our country. I mean, and so that's what's so interesting about us and about us as a creation is that we just keep getting these same patterns over and over again.
Yeah. Couldn't have said it better myself. And the final note here, which I have to say, I want to say I'm not really a sequel trilogy apologist. I apologize for, like, I'll make excuses for the Force Awakens, right? I'm like, yeah, it wasn't that bad. You guys are over, but whatever. And I am a full-on enthusiast for The Last Jedi. But then you come to The Rise of Skywalker, and I'm like, I don't know, man. That one, that's just like, that's the film that shall not be named. I'm like, I don't just, no, why'd you do this? For so many reasons. But they still had one thing that was really interesting and also a little dumb. But I think it makes a good point for our conversation today. How, in the end, they keep doing this whole thing, the resistance all throughout, and there's low numbers and no one will come to help them. And they're trying to treat like they're still the underdog, the whole trilogy. But at the very end, look who all responds to their call to help. Everyone ever. That turns out that they really shouldn't have had any challenge at all. And I think that's what blows my mind. And I don't know if this was just an oversight of the movie directors, whatever, or if it was just kind of this supposed to be this hope that there actually was more good in the universe after all, what they were trying to do. But what this speaks to is, if they were doing politics correctly, all of these people would have been here from the get-go. They would have just snuffed out the First Order and there wouldn't have been any of these films. Like, and that's where I find it interesting just to kind of think of, like, how do we know who all is on our side? And, that's where I think of, like, is the UN important? Is it important to have, like, the United States? Because even though I'm not all for federal government, like, I like to minimize federal as much as possible, go to the states. Is this where it's important to have federal government, to have things like the United Nations? Because we want countries like Russia to know that if they attack Europe or England, they're going to get every spaceship ever appearing. Would Kylo have thought twice about taking over the First Order if he knew this is what he was facing? Maybe, because it's literally would have been impossible. What do you guys think? Was this just bad politicianing? That there's do they need their own version of the UN in the Star Wars galaxy?
I think this scene suffers, like many things, from the fact that there were other minds making stuff instead of a unified, group of a confederacy of people making decisions. Because you get to The Last Jedi and there's that sequence where they call out for help before they end up on Crate and no one shows up. Well, what's the difference here? Like, well, you tell me Palpatine is back and he's got these super star destroyers that can destroy an entire planet because he's had these resources this whole time to do that, magically. And sure, then the only thing I'll say for this is that, if Billy D. Williams told me to do anything, yeah, sure, I'd listen. That's it. It's like Lando says, okay, guys, it's time to act up. Yeah, sure, I'll listen to Lando. But it falls short to me, because this is like one of my favorite tropes in fiction, is that the big dang heroes moment of all seems lost, no one's going to be there, and then suddenly someone comes up to save you in the end. This should have been that moment, but it fails because who the heck are these people? We're told they're the galaxy, they're representatives from all across the galaxy, which, once again, it's that show versus tell. We're told that, but, like, we haven't seen these people in contact with the resistance. We haven't seen, maybe in Last Jedi we had a scene where, had representatives from different planets say, we're just not feeling this. You guys look like you're about to lose. That could have been something. But once again, like, Johnson didn't know what Abrams was going to do in the 9th film. So, and that's not really his fault.
Yeah. Although,
to your point, go ahead.
I was going to say, Johnson did have a script for his own version of the 9th film. God, it was so much better. Like, infinitely better. Man.
Anyway. I think it got made into a graphic novel. I think I read part of it.
What? Really? Okay.
Oh, okay.
I need to check that out.
Yeah. To your point, like, would a UN kind of system work well? Well, let's look at our UN. They've done peacekeeping in the world, but they're not like, and they shouldn't be, they're not a one world government kind of situation to where they make all the decisions affecting all nations. They're not a European Union. They're not like what the representative of our government is for the 50 states that we have and the Commonwealths and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Frankly, I don't think that's possible.
Yeah.
I'm glad we have the United Nations. I'm glad things like UNICEF exist, WHO exists, and that we're able to look after people elsewhere. But as far as making decisions for everyone, well, who's to say that you're right?
Yeah. I'm very anti-world government, But I am in favor of stuff like the UN, stuff that's like, hey, if you cross this line, we're all going to show up. You know, like, we might not be unified, but if you cross this line, we'll be unified against you specifically. Like, I think that's a good warning out there for people. I like that. But also, to one thing that you brought up that I think is interesting, and this is like just current world government politics. So, hey, not America this time. You're welcome. I think that's why it's so important that we do support Ukraine, and why it's so hard for some people to get behind it. Because right now what they're seeing is Kylo Ren. Right now what they're seeing is some guy we don't know is the bad guy, right? But what happens is if they win, if Russia wins this, then all of a sudden they're teaming up with China. All of a sudden you realize it's the emperor. And then everybody wants to be involved. And I'm like, what if we just didn't let it get that far? What if we started here and just drew the line clearly so we don't have to watch Rise of Skywalker? Because no one wants to watch that. Adam, do you have anything you want to add? I'm just getting silly now. I might need to stop.
It's such a delicate, with something like Ukraine, it's such a delicate situation. It goes back to this whole concept of polarization. Because wherever you fall on the political landscape, you still have the issue like what's happening in what's happening in Hawaii. You have this entire community destroyed, and they're getting $700. I was listening to this tragic interview with this lady. She's like, my pets are dead. My home is destroyed. I can't get my medicine. I can't get any of my resources. My entire life is destroyed. And our government is sending them $700. But yet billions of dollars is going to solve, you know what I mean? These two problems aren't mutually exclusive. And that's part of the issue. And that goes back to the whole concept of polarization. This topic of something like Ukraine it's so nuanced. It's so detailed. And, it's hard to even tell. It's hard to always know what the right decision is until after it's already passed. And I wouldn't want to be the leaders trying to make these decisions on what to do about it. I don't think it's a really easy answer. Now, on the subject of something like Star Wars, they had the Republic. They had the resources. They didn't learn from history. They didn't say, well, we were demilitarized and the emperor came to power, so let's demilitarize again. That would end well. It worked so well the first time around. So it's just kind of like it's an important criticism of us learning from our history and learning from our mistakes. Isn't there? It wasn't Thomas Jefferson it was Winston Churchill that said, "Those who do not learn from history those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it." And even I think C.S. Lewis made a comment that history isn't always the same, but often rhymes.
Yeah, I like that one.
I might be getting my quotes wrong, so people can comment. And on the subject of the ships coming in, to Christian's point, Lord of the Rings did it so much better. I mean,
true.
The Rohirrim showing up at the top of the hill, it was such a payoff from the fort. That's such great storytelling. It's the exact same thing. It's such great storytelling. They get the signal off. They don't know if hope is coming. The city's about to be lost. And there it is. There's the Rohirrim at the top of the hill in the sunlight. So good.
Yeah.
So good.
Man. Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more with that one. And yeah, I mean, to your point, there's never a just this or that. And that's where politics are important. It's part of why we're talking about it, right? Even within your church. And I've made this example before, but I think it's so important. It's why we can't let polarization get in the way. All of us would say it is important that we help the poor in our city. Also, all of us would say it is important that we do missions. All of us would say it is important we upkeep the church. It is important that we, even if you just keep it simple of like, do we feed the poor in our community, or are we going to build them houses? Well, the way a lot of times it's set up is we put all of our money to feed the poor. That's a great thing. But then the two people who were really trying to do this other mission for the church where they were going to build homes feel like they got gypped, and now they're upset. They're angry. And that's where politics are important in your church and outside your church. Why? Because you have to find a way to delegate these things to work it out, right? Much to our examples in Star Wars, if you just only put all the focus on Emperor or the rebellion, like what happened in the original trilogy. You get a lot of people like Han Solo who might starve, pretty much have to do illegal activities if they're going to make enough money to get by. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of terrible. But that's what happens when you make it only a 1 or a 2D kind of situation. You make everything black and white instead of realizing maybe these people are caring about something important and I'm also caring about something important. And how do we do both things well? Or what are we willing to sacrifice so that we could do something else well? You know, anybody have anything else, Christian?
No, I think we've covered a lot. We went over 25,000 years of history in an hour and 30 minutes. So there's still plenty more we could go, but I do think I've said all I need to say.
So you would say that it perhaps is time for the wrap up? Is that what you would say?
Indeed. Yes.
I think we could do that. I think we could do a wrap up here. So I did want to go ahead. We're going to do, as always, we do our recommendations. I'm not sure what to recommend. I'm going to recommend reading more Blue Beetle comics because I've been reading a lot since I watched that movie. And because I read some when I was in high school and I loved it. And I'm like, you know what? I might still love this. And I do. I love Blue Beetle comics. Check them out. They're worth it. Christian, you have any recommendations for everybody?
Yeah, sure. Just to stick it to the Star Wars theme for right now. If you want a good old-fashioned game, that sure, some of the graphics aren't as good as they were when it released forever ago. It's not as modern as everything now. Go play some Star Wars Rogue Squadron, and you can enjoy, guilt-free, a rebellion, fighting against an empire, and becoming a new republic, and just blasting the empire in ships, like guilt-free. It's wonderful.
Adam, you have any recommendations for everybody?
I'm kind of at a really in-between time. I'm not really, other than I haven't been into anything lately. I'm kind of between stuff, so I don't have any recommendations. I need recommendations. I want really good fantasy stories, and really good. I don't really know where to poke all of them at. On the subject of Star Wars, you can't go wrong with the Old Republic 1 and 2. The Knights of the Republic 1 and 2. You can never go wrong with those games. There's just great, wonderful nostalgia. And then now that they've shown up on every platform, including your phone, there's no reason not to have played them at this point.
Yeah. Have to agree. Also, the old Clone Wars video games, phenomenal. Battlefront, got to check it out if you haven't. Man, you're missing out. There's so many good Star Wars stories. If you haven't seen, I know you mentioned earlier the Tales or the Legends of the Jedi. That was a little mini series Disney Plus did. It added so much to the lore, and I found out that not a ton of people seen it. So watch it, guys. Watch it. Do us a favor. Rate and review this show, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or preferably Podchaser if you have the time. Just takes a second to go over there, leave a rating and review. Go to our show notes down below, see the rest of our primary political series. Subscribe on YouTube. Go to our store for some fun merch. And remember, we're all a chosen people, a geekdom of priests.
This was an Anazao Ministries podcast. If you enjoyed this show and would like to learn more about our network, be sure to check out the Anazao Ministries podcast network.